So would
like
you say to all the parents who are like convinced, who are being very, very offended by the anti-white bigotry of CRT, would you tell them that, well, are you really giving it the benefit of the doubt? All right. They don't intend to cause anti-white racism. They're just
I
taking that offense. So like calm down. We need, like, their
well,
intent matters more than your feelings, right?
Well, I mean, it depends. So, like a lot of the, so I do videos on curriculums, and like I'm not going to get too much into this because we're like brushing up on 2 hours. But like if you're teaching Ibram X Kendi, like, and I know he's disputed whether he's a critical race theory scholarship, but just for the point, if you're teaching Ibram X Kendi and he says the only way to remedy past discrimination is for positive discrimination in front of Black people, then that is like actually anti-white. Like it's like intentionally designed to.
So let's bring it back to a justice analogy. All right, let's say that I'm robbing you. Okay, I'm breaking into your house and I'm stealing your Warhammer figurines that I know you have. Actually, don't know. I'm stealing all your Warhammer figurines and then I take them back to my house. Okay, now I stop. I don't do that anymore. Justice has been achieved.
No, not
You can't discriminate against me. You can't cause me harm by taking away my newly found figurines, right? We
no,
wouldn't call
not
that justice, right? And
no,
so
not
I don't like this interpretation, like positive discrimination. Like, if historical circumstances has made it so where like white people have a disproportionate amount of wealth, a disproportionate amount of positions of power because of disproportionate education. And again, this is not anti-white. It's just recognizing like you kind of like the historical circumstances that led to this, remedying that. Like if you take away someone's like feet and start them like, that's a horrible analogy. I'm going to the standard analogy. If you make someone start 50 feet behind, you're not like to pretend that because there's no longer that barrier in the way, or that you're not pushing them back behind further. We haven't achieved any sort of like reconciliation. There's no justice there. There's just the absence of harm.
So to your point about the like the stealing analogy, like the reason I think that's flawed is because we do have statute of limitations. Like, you know, if like this is your, I know it sounds like weird, but like if this is yours for like generations, then like eventually we let it go. Now murder doesn't have statute of limitations, et cetera, but like you can't prosecute kids for the murders that their parents committed.
Of course
So
not.
like
We wouldn't approach it that way. Like I think it's incorrect to say this. That I think it's incorrect to say that like CRT and people who are advocates of like affirmative action want to punish white people for the sins of their father. Well, what they're trying to do is enact policies that don't favor white people anymore, or that don't favor the circumstances that have led to this like being a thing.
To the point I'm trying to make is that, yeah, if like you were to steal from me now and like, you know, I would call police, authorities, blah, blah, blah. I might pull an OJ Simpson and raid your hotel room and steal it back and then get 10 years because I killed somebody in the 90s and got away with it. But like something, right? Like you call some authority. But like if a certain amount of time passed by, like whatever the statute of limitations in the jurisdiction, like we would let that go. Like we would, like, because you can't, there's a point beyond where you could remedy this. And the reason we do that is to protect the accused, which would be like you in that scenario. Because like if you could just bring up a prosecution at any point in time, at any point in the future.
Well, of course, the analogy wasn't to say that we should punish like future generations. The analogy was to say that like you can't say that justice has been achieved.
Well, I didn't say it's been achieved.
If the statute of limitations does pass, you can never say that justice has been achieved, and the harm is still there. The material effects might still be there, and the way we prosecute individuals ought to be different than how we correct societal inequities.
So I'm not saying that justice would have been achieved by like letting it go eventually. But what I'm saying is that there's a certain point where you can't rectify what was done. And like we are talking about the sins of past generations and like what we should do now to current generations to remedy problems.
What if we use more neutral language to, like, instead of saying the sins of past generations, we talk about historical circumstances led to this point in time that can be explanatory for why certain groups of people are concentrated in certain areas, why there are income inequalities, why there are gaps in education, why there are gaps in like job opportunity. We can use history and circumstance and even personal narratives and alongside the data to help better explain these inequities, so we can address policies more targetedly towards those populations to achieve better outcomes. I think that's a perfectly reasonable like position, don't you?
I mean, sure. I mean, you can make that case, and like I, I think one of the disputes, and we're not going to like resolve it, especially in like the 5 or so minutes that we have, is
Bullshit.
like how much
Think more highly of yourself. We can do this. Come on.
is that how much of the gap, how much of the gaps in our societies, how much of the disparate outcomes can be attributed to past like racism versus individual choices? Because like I'm a big fan. One of the reasons why I'm like I do want more emphasis on history, specifically Black history in the United States of America, is because Black people did work to overcome discrimination in a bunch of circumstances that nobody talks about. So like in the what you call it, in the 40s to the 60s, and it might be the 30s to the 50s. So like please nerds on the internet correct me. Like Black people under Jim Crow lifted themselves out of poverty at an extraordinary rate. They went from 89% of their population in poverty to 49%. It's amazing. And this is while there was all this active discrimination happening. And that's not the first time that's happened with Black Americans in the United States of America. They became literate in like a generation post-slavery. That's like almost never happened in recorded history. And like post-slavery, like to be clear though, the Reconstruction era was better for Black people than post-Reconstruction. So like it's not like that was in the absolute worst times, because Reconstruction was much better.
Do you think that there's a good dichotomy between like individual choices and racism? Do you think that those are cleanly separable?
I think that people can make individual choices, and we've seen through other groups in other situations around the world that can actually overcome racism, like the Chinese that live in Malaysia.
Again, we don't make policy decisions because some people can't overcome.
I think we should remove barriers as best as we can, right? But like the Chinese in Malaysia
but not just remove barriers. If there's harm being caused, removing a barrier is great. It's better than nothing. But what about like moving people back up to what would be considered neutral ground?
Like I don't know how you do that without creating more violations of people's rights. And like the examples I'm trying to give are like the Chinese in Malaysia. Like you can look to their laws. I don't know if it's still in the books today, but it was in like the 80s, 90s. They have active discrimination quotas, all these things against Chinese people. And Chinese people still represent like a ridiculously huge share of the wealthy and like the higher in society in terms of outcomes. They do better.
Yeah, so like the benefit of intersectionality, like it's showing that a group did well. That's great. Let's look at why they did well. Let's look at what their circumstances are. And let's not assume because this different group did well, that means that this other different group could do well if only they tried harder and made better choices.
But the point I'm trying to make is that there can be explicit discrimination in the laws that is intended to cause harm, right? Chinese and Malaysia, excellent example. Sure. And like it could not have that output. And I would be more concerned about the explicit discrimination and getting rid of that, because to me, when people like when I hear when I examine the history of like Black people overcoming, in parts, obviously there was a lot of restrictions against them that they did not overcome, but overcoming in parts discrimination, I want to remove the barrier so that I can see like what they can do, like because I don't want to, you know what, I'm actually going to save the sports analogy because society isn't the meritocracy that sports are.
I guess my response to that would be like, you shouldn't worry about CRT being taught in schools. Like, yeah, it might be a little bit harder for a couple of kids to do better, but remember, you could just make better choices, choose not to believe in it. And like, you know, and eventually it won't matter. The statute of limitations will pass. That was a little bit jokey, but also like,
I actually do think that I actually do think it is empowering to teach students that so I know you're joking, but I do think it is empowering to teach students that they're in control of their own destiny and that there are choices, and you can show them the numbers that they can make to improve their outcome and set up their future generations for success.
Great. Yeah, and one of those things that you could do with that individual choice is to address systemic inequalities. You can choose to address not just yourself, but try to make life better for other people by advocating for policy positions and proposals that are going to make life better for everybody. That's one of the choices you could make.